Welcome everybody back to this session with Nir Esterman, and Nir is going to be talking about intergenerational trauma, which I think is such a fascinating and important topic. Resmaa Menakem touched on this as well, as those of you who were at his session will remember. I think Nir is going to go into some different layers of related to intergenerational trauma, inheritance, and transmission. So I'm going to read Nir's bio, and then we can get into a discussion. Nir is a trauma therapist from a family of Holocaust survivors. His work explores intergenerational trauma and the various levels of inheritance and transmission. He discusses epigenetic factors working with survivor's guilt and family constellations therapy, which he will surely explain to us as he goes. Hi, Nir, welcome.
Hi, good evening. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here.
Hello, everybody.
So I really wanted to have you, I love the idea that you were participating in this conference because I think of the topic that you're dealing with and the way that you were talking about the various layers of intergenerational trauma. I think this is a concept that more and more people are becoming familiar with or they're hearing about, but I think it's hard for people to get a grasp on what it really means. You know, obviously we all know we have ancestors and that they lived and they had tough experiences long ago, but what does that have to do with how I experience myself in my body today? And how did they come to me? How did their experiences come to impact mine?
Well, it's a great starting point. So let's see. Once upon a time, we used to live in tribes. And in a way, we were all a part of a system, a thing, a family, a big family, an entire tribe. And it was, everybody knew that they're not really alone or they're not completely individual, and that their lives are intertwined in different ways in the other people from the village, and also the village itself as an entity, and also the spirits of the place and their ancestors as a part of it. So it was all quite holistic, even if sometimes violent, you know, jungle and stuff. At some point in our history, actually quite recent history, we began to promote the idea that we are individuals. Now, I guess it was some kind of a counter move. And we said, yeah, you can't control me anymore. I'm master of my own fate, which was an amazing move on so many levels. On the other hand, it was also a counter move. And like most counter moves, it left something behind. And what it left behind was actually the connection that we had to things greater than ourselves. And I'm not talking religion now, although it's also a part. I'm talking about being connected to our full inheritance. And what do I mean by that? So imagine that your grandparents came to wherever you live from another country. Let's say they grew up in, I don't know, the UK and moved to the US. And not such a big deal today, but it was, let's say, 80 years ago. So it probably was quite difficult to leave everything they knew behind, friends, families, whatever, and come to a new place. So being an immigrant, I guess we all know, is quite difficult. I'm from Israel, and we all here, almost all of us here are immigrants to some degree, 2, 3, or 7 generations before. And we see that each person who came here also left something of his heart behind, maybe his childhood, maybe his first wife, or the food that he liked best. You know, that's an easy one. But it's also possible that, you know, our parents went through war. In my case, my parents went through the Holocaust. And you know, they lost family. They lost brothers and sisters or cousins or entire culture. it's possible that your great-grandmother was sexually abused. Well, statistically, one of them was. I'm sorry, that's the statistics of today, 1 in 4. Basically, any difficult thing that happened to our ancestors may affect us. Not necessarily all of them affect us, but some for sure will. And there are different mechanisms for that. Would you like me to go into the mechanisms, Karine?
Yes, that
Yes.
would be amazing.
Yes.
Thank you, Nir. Yeah.
Okay. So I would say there are different kinds of mechanisms. The first and relatively new one to our understanding is the epigenetic ones. So this would be the science approach to this. From a scientific point of view, let's say if you are a woman, you were an egg in your mother's womb when she was a baby in your grandmother's body. So if your grandmother went through, let's say, famine, as was the case in Holland in the Holocaust, or through anything difficult, her stress hormones went up, and this affected both your mother as a baby, but also you as a single cell in her body. Now, the changes it caused are not necessarily to the DNA itself. DNA doesn't change so easily, or at least if it changes, it's not in such a set way. However, there are other kind of changes called epigenetic changes. It means that the DNA stays the same, but the way in which each gene or relevant genes are expressed is changed. Some genes are silenced. Instead of being expressed to some degree, they are not expressed at all. Some others may be overexpressed. Some genes may be expressed, but not fully. Some genes may be expressed, let's say, maybe copied to what's called RNA, but there something stop the RNA from being turned into proteins. So I'm no longer a scientist. I used to be. I studied, I have a first degree in molecular biology and computer science and a second degree in science teaching and interdisciplinary studies. But I haven't been doing it for 15 years. So I won't go with you into the full mechanisms. I would give a more general description of these epigenetic mechanisms. Some of them is like a chemical group is bonding to the DNA in a way which interferes with transcription of this gene to become eventually proteins. And some other mechanisms is that in the fluid of the egg of the mother, and there are different very small molecules called miRNA, which sort of connect to regular RNA and doesn't allow it again to be expressed in the body. And there are other mechanisms such as histone effects, and I don't really want to go into it. What is relevant is that once upon a time, science believed that all these epigenetic signs, all these modulations to the changes to the DNA didn't survive the creation of a new child. They thought that they help a person to better adapt to his current situation. For example, if I'm in a very violent situation, I should be more aroused. I should be more vigilant. I should be ready to fight or flight. But once the situation is ended, I should be able to stop it. If I can't stop this hyperarousal, I got PTSD or complex PTSD, and that makes life more difficult. However, if I have it, then my children and my grandchildren are actually at a higher risk of having it as well, probably 30% more. A very interesting research in Canada actually found that grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were given, were sent to psychiatric evaluation and treatment 300% more than the general population. Now it's the grandchildren. They don't know how to smell the Second World War, but it's there. It's somewhere there. And the children of people who suffered PTSD in war have a greater chance of suffering from PTSD themselves already as children. Some of it can be explained by these epigenetic changes. If I have hyperarousal as a small child, my life as a small child will be more difficult, and I'm more likely to get involved in difficult situations and react in a bad way and get stuck in my hyperarousal. So that's one level of it. And it's still new in research, and we still don't understand the mechanisms well enough. And most of the research is done on simple animals because it's really difficult to do a 7th-generation research in human beings, or even 2, if you want to really look at it. And we can't choose what changes to make. We just have to go backwards and say, oh, you had this kind of trauma. Well, do you agree that we test your children in 15 or 50 years? Yeah, good luck with that. Let's see what we'll find.
Not so easy. Yeah, not so easy.
Yeah, not so easy. Now, there are other ways, other mechanisms of this transfer. A second one, and very logical, is the psychological one. If my parents are traumatized, then I grew up in a traumatized context. My normal reaction didn't necessarily receive a normal response. My needs, my emotional, my attachment needs weren't necessarily properly met, just because my parents had their own difficulties. I'm not judging them in any way, just a fact. My father lost both his parents before he was 6. He actually doesn't remember anything from his family. I mean, he jokes about it, but and the only thing we found out about his family was when we went into the records between the Russian and Polish borders, and we found that when his orphanage came back, they said that his father was drafted into the Red Army and died in the war, and his mother died in some hospital in Uzbekistan. And this way, at the same day, I felt for the first time that my father didn't just have a family, but also that I have a grandfather and a grandmother, and that they're dead. Like, I'm really glad to have this feeling that I have them, but whoa, now I understand in my body there is lots of unresolved and unacknowledged grief, because not only I never knew them, he doesn't remember them, and he couldn't allow himself to grieve, and what he couldn't handle goes to me. So whatever it is that our parents and their parents can't handle well, in some way or another, goes down the generations. So psychological transfer is another way. And a third way, which is definitely not researchable, but I have enough personal examples of how it works. There's also, at least to my belief, and maybe someday science will define it differently, there is also some sort of energetic transfer. People seem to carry information in such a detailed way about past experiences of their ancestors, which is just not easily explainable by the normal ways. People close their eyes and imagine something about their grandparents whom they never met, and something comes up, and they say, well, that's what comes up. I don't know. I'll ask my mom. And then they go and ask her, yeah, your father did have a brother who died from tuberculosis. How did you know that? We never speak about his brother. Right. So these are in like a very short headlines about the basic mechanisms of intergenerational transfer. And I would like to say something about how we feel it, because, you know, it's very nice in general to say, yeah, this is this phenomena, and let's do something about it. But we also have traumas, and we also have issues, and some of the stuff that we deal with do not belong to our parents or to our other ancestors. So how do we tell the difference? Well, it's surprisingly easy. This is how it goes. If it is our feeling that in some way, even if it's really difficult, we're up for the mission, if we feel that, yeah, we need some help, maybe we need therapy, but this is not endless. I will have to work at it for some time, but eventually I will get over it. This is more the atmosphere of my own personal issues. When issues comes down through the generations, they feel bigger than ourselves. They may feel like black holes, pulling us all the time, at every single moment, awake or not, into them. Depression quite often feel this way, like I'm being pulled into something which is bigger than me, and I can't help it, and I do my best, and sometimes it helps and sometimes it's not. And it very often has to do with a missing person in my family, someone who died in a tragic way, or whose life or death was not acknowledged. Sometimes it's not even something tragic, let's say a miscarriage or an abortion. And for a few weeks or a few months, there was a living person in the mother's womb, and then they died for whatever reason. And culturally, we don't acknowledge it. It's like, well, if they weren't born alive, so who cares? No, take the pill, everything will be okay. But actually, it's there. And many mothers who lose a child this way, and it is a real loss, find themselves afterwards suffering from post-birth depression, not knowing why. And quite often, they're not the first one to get lost. Their mother or their grandmother also lost children in the same way, and it all comes down to us. This is why it's important to tell children about what happens, because they feel. You know, we all feel in our body, in our soul, in ways which we cannot necessarily explain how it works. I can't always explain how it works, but I know I feel it. Okay, it's like my small, we have two girls, me and my wife, and my wife had two miscarriages and one abortion, which is much more difficult than a miscarriage, I must say, emotionally. My first family constellation teacher was all about, you should tell your children about miscarriages and abortions. I was like, how am I going to tell them about the abortion away? And, you know, they kept asking for a small brother or sister, like 3 times a day. And my wife was a doula. They were born at home. They have movies of the birth. They were watching it a lot and asking for a brother and sister all the time. And one time I participated in a session as a translator, as an assistant. And we saw in that session that the client who suffered from some sort of cancer could trace the history, the beginning point of this cancer to an unacknowledged abortion. I was like, okay, that's it. I'm not avoiding this anymore. I will find a way to tell them. I have no idea how, but I will find a way. And suddenly it hit me that I don't have to tell them how the children didn't get to be born, just the fact that they were here. And I took the time a little bit before dinner and asked them, do you know, you always asked about for a brother and a sister. Do you know that actually you have, in a way, brothers and sisters? And like, no, tell us all about it. And I was like, well, you know, some children begin pregnancy but are not born. And your mom had 3 of these. Like, And then I followed the suggestion of my teacher, Sakino, and I asked them, would you like to put plates in this dinner for the children? Yes! And they chose to give them portions of their food, which happened to be grandmother lasagna, which is like a rare treat. And then they asked me, can you read us 5 stories today, not just 2, because you're 5?
Oh.
And it was like that for 2 or 3 days, and then suddenly, you know, they still ask for a brother or sister like once a month, not 5 times a week. You know, they knew, because we all know. We know inside that someone was lost. We know inside that someone's heart was broken. We know inside that someone was abused. We know inside that something isn't like we're being told. Not because people try necessarily to lie to us, but because it's so much easier to avoid the trauma, or to say it in like in a heroic way. Like, yeah, you know, your grandmother, she had a really difficult life, married 5 husbands, and look what a family she raised, what an amazing grandmother. And like, wow, 5 husbands to grieve. Wow. Work to be done here. Yeah, okay, maybe I got a bit
Yeah.
carried. I like the subject.
No, it's
Ask me away, Karine.
amazing. Oh, this is very, I mean, there's so much there, Nir. I think one of the things, and there are a lot of questions popping up as well, I can see in the chat box, and we'll be sure to try to get to some of those for everybody who's on the call. It just really, as you're talking, it really brought it home to me, you know, as human beings, this need we have, one, to acknowledge that connection that we feel, that you're referring to, that really is like a felt sense in us. And we're part of this beautiful continuity of life on planet Earth, aren't we? And there are cultures that still acknowledge ancestors more consciously, and this feels very much like a you know, a way of acknowledging that we are part of this unfolding story of humanity on Earth, and it feels important to do that. You know, so it's like all of the epigenetic traces, all of the ways that these other traits, and Resma actually spoke to this earlier as well. He talked about how trauma can it gets decontextualized over time, so it can show up and it seems like it's a personality trait, or it seems like a cultural trait. And so that's the behavioral and the psychological aspects that you were speaking to. And I just find that really beautiful. It feels like it really embeds us in this greater human story where we belong.
Yeah, I'd like to add another example. For example, and one of the things my first teacher said in family constellation was, she doesn't know people with ADHD. She knows people with transgenerational PTSD. And I was like, whoa, that's a big statement. But then I've encountered some parents who came to work with me on their children having difficulties, like fighting all the time and being really triggered by really small things. Like when they were like fight, and they tell me, you know, it's like they're fighting for their lives over they can't have chocolate now. Like, okay, so maybe it's, you know, you're not, maybe you're not a good parent. But chances are that's not the issue. And quite often when I work with them, we find that one of their ancestors actually had war PTSD, actually had really difficult experiences that left scars in their systems. And when we do the work and acknowledge their pain and their losses, their difficulties, their horror, and sometimes they were the victims and sometimes they were the perpetrators, difficult word, and the people who cause hurt. And sometimes quite often they were both, like, you know, I kill or I'm being killed and my friends are being killed and war is hell. And when the trauma of the ancestor is really acknowledged and given space and given healing, then suddenly, and sometimes the next day, the next time the child doesn't get his chocolate bar, he's like, it's so sad, and he cries, you know? Instead of fighting, he starts to cry. So it's like an entire layer of fighting has went away, and yet there's still work. But most parents would definitely deal more easily with a crying child than with a fighting child. And you can change the fighting and crying for basically anything, because traumas affect us long after they're finished. We all know it here in this conference, but not only us, but also our children. This is actually the best reason for me to do this work. Like, you know, I'm more or less okay with myself. Well, that's what I would like to think. I found some balance which works well enough for me most of the time. But then I see my children like, okay, that's not a good enough balance. I have to do something better about it.
Nir, someone asked a really good question in the comments,
Yes.
and I thought this would be a good moment to pose it.
Yes.
Laura, you asked, are adopted children doubly affected by their biological history and their adoptive parents' trauma as well? It's a really interesting question. I'm wondering what you've encountered in your work.
Well, I haven't worked a lot with adopted children. I worked a little bit, but I learned about it. So I'll give a bit of my experience and a bit of official response. The official response, which I also encountered, is that adopted children have a first loyalty to their biological parents. So if the adopting parents do not respect the fact that these children are alive first, like they receive the gift of life from their biological parents, even if they're like, you know, sperm and egg donors, they're still the biological parents. So if you look at it first, the epigenetic stuff is definitely from the biological parents. Second, if this child was living for 9 months in the womb of his biological mother, there's lots of processes that happen during these 9 crucial months, both on the physiological and the epigenetic level. If it was a surrogate womb, I don't know the word in English, I'm sorry if I'm using an unpleasant one, then it's also hair coming into the system. So if we tell the child that he is adopted, or that he was given to us by his parents in some way or another, and we don't try to hide it, because secrets create problems, just say, we are your either adopting parents, or we're the parents who grew you up, who took care of you, and you also have biological parents, and we thank them for you being alive, then we have harmony. But if, like one of my students told me, she's a single mother for 2 children and she doesn't know the father. It was like sperm donation, and she's been told that she should tell the children that they don't have a father, that they have a mother, and this is all that they have, and they don't have a father. Which, on a practical day-to-day basis, it's in a way true. Like, all they have is their mother. But, you know, telling someone, at least today, we still can't have a child without a father. We still don't have the technology. So there has to be a father. And if you're telling a child who knows in his bones, in his DNA, in his very essence and soul, that there is a father, and telling him that you don't have a father, what does it do to him psychologically and on so many levels, you know? And I told her, you know, they have a father. Maybe they will never meet their father, but they have a father. And it will be good for you to tell them this. But before you do that, let's do some work. Just, you know, on family constellation, we do sort of ritualistic work that allows us to say things we can't necessarily say to people, but we can say them in the ritual, and somehow it affects. And we did that. And the next week she came to the class and said, well, you know, well, I have 2 boys. One of them doesn't really care so much about it, but the other one, even though I didn't tell him anything, started to draw pictures of his father, even though I didn't tell him anything about it. Somehow he was touched by this, and he seems to be better. So yeah, we get from both lineages. We get first from the biological one, We can make the damages smaller if we acknowledge and respect the biological parents, and we can make them worse if we try to hide the fact that the person has biological parents as well as the parents who took care of him for his entire life.
Thank you, Nir. Yeah, great explanation. And I can relate to that as the child who was adopted by one parent, only to find out later that I had a different biological parent. And no one, never having been told that at all as a child, I used to ask my mother repeatedly, am I adopted? Am I adopted? Am I adopted? And she got so frustrated because she never, ever said a word about it. And she didn't know why I came up with that cockamamie idea.
Because you knew in the body, you knew.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's beautiful. And I think I love what you say about not shrouding this knowing in secrecy, because it really challenges as well the child's own perception, doesn't it? And their own self-knowing, which is an important piece as well as of course this layer where they're attached.
It's even more than that. The children carry for us what we cannot carry. What we put in the shadow, the children will put in our face. So whatever it is that it's so difficult for us with them has to do with our issues, and our issues has to do with our parents' issues, which has to do with their parents' issues. And sometimes we have to go several generations backwards to find like a better solution. I can recall, I'll give it as a general example, but it's not exactly what happened there, but in general, a client came up and a student client came up and asked for a session, and the session went to some difficult situation. And I was like, well, this feels like a situation in which it's good to have a mother. So I asked one of the participants to represent his mother. And student was like, I feel disconnected, I'm dissociated. I'm like, okay, maybe you need a mother as well. So I asked for another one. And the grandmother was like, I'm not in my body, I can't help. So I went to the next one, and the great grandmother was like, I don't know what's going on, but I can't be of help here. And this went 7 generations. And the 7th representative stood up and said like, oh, it feels like I've been raped. And wow. 7th generation back, we can't even know if she was like raped as in someone grabbed her in an alleyway, or if it was her husband and she felt, and she was 12 and it was rape. We can't tell, and we'll never have the information. What we do know that in the session, once we acknowledged it, then the 6th generation felt that she has a mother and felt better, and then the 5th generation felt she has a mother. And we got back to the original situation, and suddenly it was easier to deal with. In family constellation, we consider the connection to our family, to our ancestors, not just through the traumas, but through the support, the resources, the abilities, the life experience, the life force that goes through them, to be the number one resource that we have. And for many of us, we are less alive and less connected and less at peace, not only because our own traumas, but because somewhere above us in the timeline, there was a horrible disconnection. I can tell about myself that I grew up like a scientist, and I had cancer when I was 22, and it was after a difficult breakup, and this would led later to me going to therapy. That's a different story, and I did lots of work, and it took me some time, and like probably 12 years of work or 15 years of work before I was ready to go into the intergenerational stuff. I didn't start there. But I kept having this felt sense that I have this unresolved issue with God. It's like it was God the Holocaust, and how could you allow that? Well, you know, I'm Jewish in second generation, so for me it's a big deal. I can understand intellectually that 6 million Jews died and another 54 non-Jews died in the war. But that's my people's story. And we were killed, and not only us, also other people like homosexuals and other ethnicities, gypsies, were killed deliberately, not as a part of a war. And I couldn't understand the idea of a good God and the Holocaust. It just didn't work. And there was this great rift within me. And I think I worked at it for a year within myself, and I tried to touch it in different ways with different facilitators. And at some point in family constellation, in group work, people get different roles to play. And I was given the role of a small child, like a baby, who died in the Holocaust because his mother didn't have milk to feed him. It was a pretty harsh role, but I was lying there as this baby, and suddenly, I don't know where from, I just felt this awesome scream coming through every fiber of my body. I am dying, and I screamed on the top of my lungs. I will not do it to you. I just screamed, I am dying, and I started to cry so badly. And the really difficult thing was that I cried, and around me it moved people, but at the same time, my inside feeling was that this cry reaches the heavens and finds the gates closed. I was like, this is probably the most difficult session I've ever had. It wasn't even mine. It was like so difficult. I cried so hard. You know, and it ended, and I went home, and half a year exactly later, I had a session for myself, and I told my teacher, which is German, and her father was a soldier in the Nazi army. And I told her, so this is my issue, me, God, in the Holocaust. And she was like, and she quoted someone who said the Holocaust was done by men, not by God. And inside me, I was like, are you going to bail out on me? But then she thought about it some more, and she's very experienced. And it's like, how does it feel in your body? And I was like, it feels like someone took a sword and cut my roots 3 meters below me. It's like I have roots until there, and I can see some of the roots beyond that point, but there is no connection. And I've been working for 12 or 15 years on deepening my roots, but I cannot cross this chasm. So we worked on this. And I will not go into the details.
Yeah, go ahead. I don't want to take too much.
One more minute. I won't go into the details. Yeah. Bottom line is, I finished this session giving this cry again. Only this time I felt like the gates opened. And from this experience alone, I know how it feels to have a post-trauma heal itself. Because I could feel the dendrites, I could feel my nervous system crossing over the chasm, literally as a felt sense. And from that day on, I don't have an issue with God. I'm not a believer, by the way, but for me, God is being one with everything. And I don't have an issue with this anymore. So this is the power of intergenerational healing for me. Yes, I'm sorry if it was a slightly long example.
That was beautiful. It was really powerful. I'm just recognizing that there's many people who are very curious to know, and I know that we want to move into an exercise to help ground all of this.
Let's have a short exercise, and then we'll have time for your questions. Okay.
Great.
So my invitation, as for any exercise, is do it only if you feel like it. Do it only to the degree that you would like to do. If any steps feels wrong, skip it or stop. If you feel overwhelmed, take a glass, drink some water, stop the exercise, feel your body, regulate yourself. It's okay. I'm not going to go into trauma, but we're around trauma. So mind yourselves. And let's begin. So I invite you, if you like, to close your eyes and sit comfortably. And we'll do a very short voyage in our mind's eye, in our soul's eye. So first, imagine yourself as you see yourself in your mind's eye. And pay attention to how you are, to your bodily sensations, to your emotions, to your thoughts or thoughts patterns. You can pay attention to where your attention is going. Are you heavy? Are you light? Is anything pushing or pulling you as a sensation? Are you young? Are you capable? Not so? Whatever is okay. You don't have to change anything, just pay attention. And now, in your mind's eye, choose something that happened not to you, but to one or more of your ancestors, that you feel deeply inside, that somehow influences you. And you don't have to think about what it is exactly. Maybe you have a name for it, maybe you don't. Just give it some representation in your mind's eye, somewhere behind yourself, in whatever distance it feels right for you. And don't touch it. Don't go there. Don't dive in. We just acknowledge that somewhere in the past, some trauma affected some of your ancestors. That's all. And still affects you. And again, pay attention to your body and see how you are now that we have acknowledged this trauma. The representation in your mind's eye can take any form, it doesn't matter. What is important is that you don't go into it right now in this form of 5 minutes work. For some of you, it may feel like it rows them or makes things heavier. For some of you, it will be a relief and that something is finally acknowledged, and there are many other options. All are okay. Now add another representation. Add a representation for that ancestor or ancestors that suffered this difficult event or difficult times. They were really there. We were not there. Maybe we had our difficulties which were influenced, but we were not there. So in your mind's eye, invite a representation for them. And again, it doesn't matter how they come, like in a physical, human form or in any other way. Just see what happens to you when they're added to our consciousness. When we can acknowledge, and yes, something happened, and yes, it happened to them. How does it affect us? Just know it for yourself. And take a breath. And now we will go looking for a resource deep in our ancestral line. Imagine yourself looking even more backwards through this ancestor or ancestors who went through the trauma to someone who was before them, maybe just one generation before, maybe, I don't know, back before slavery or back before Christianity or back before patriarchy or back before, the first sin. Wherever it takes you is okay. Just go back through the generations until you find just one ancestor who was not affected by this trauma. And you don't know who they are, most probably, maybe you do, if they're in the recent past. And you don't have to know anything about them. Just know that sometime there was once a human being who did not suffer from this specific trauma, who was more whole than the person who went through this trauma. Imagine this long line, maybe it's 3 people long, maybe it's 700 people long. But at some point, there is an ancestor who had the strength and the health and the fuller connection that we would like to have for ourselves. They had it just because they didn't go through the traumas that the next generation had to go through. And look at them, at these ancestors or this ancestor. How does it feel to be in touch with them? To be reminded in our body, in our soul, that a more complete state is there in our genes, in our collective unconscious, in our family collective unconscious. Because not only trauma is transferred, but also resources and healing. And when we connect there, we can get them. Look at the person who was in the trauma. How are they affected in your mind's eye by the presence of this healthy ancestor? What support can they receive? Now take a deep breath. And imagine that the people who were in the trauma, who survived through the trauma, tell you, "You are my descendant. And this trauma is mine. I went through this trauma. And it is enough that I suffered from it." Imagine they tell you that they're supported enough now to shoulder their own traumas and that you do not have to carry their trauma for them any longer. And maybe it makes something changes in your body, and it's completely fine if not, just a 5 minutes exercise. But maybe something within you, just by imagining and through the imagination connecting to our ancestral past, not only as a source of trauma, but also as a source of health and healing. You can step out of this role of carrying this trauma for someone else. And if so, that I've done my job today well. And if not, I hope that sometime in the future it will happen to you. Take a moment to breathe. Get yourself back to the here and now in whichever way is good for you. You can move your body a bit, feel your feet on the floor or your bottom on whatever you're sitting on. Take a sip of water, stretch, smile. Feel your spine. Thank yourself for whatever you allowed yourself to experience. I hope it was interesting and meaningful. I don't have any option to read everything that you write because you're too many people, but I trust Karine will bring me the most appropriate to these formal questions.
Nir,
Yes.
I want to thank you so much for that. We're getting a lot of beautiful comments thanking you as well for that journey. So I think it was very moving.